Christian nationalists want to turn America into a theocracy, a government under biblical rule. If things go their way this election, it could mean more power for them and fewer rights for you. I'm Heath Drusen, and on the new season of Extremely American, I'll take you inside the movement that seeks to rebuild the country in God's image. Listen to Extremely American from Boise State Public Radio, part of the NPR network.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. Today, our panel includes Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Kyle Pfannenstiel with the Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Richert, senior reporter and blogger with Idaho Education News. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
All right. Well, we are going to start with a wrap up of the first official week of the 2025 Idaho legislature. And I want to start with Governor Little's State of the State speech on Monday. So, Ruth, let me start the conversation with you. Idaho Reports broke down the governor's speech. What were the big takeaways from that State of the State address?
Sure. Idaho Reports does a live show after every State of the State address, and so I can give you kind of a rundown of some of the highlights. It was a 24-minute speech, but I'm going to try and condense some of the headlines. As usual, Governor Little prioritized education. Every State of the State he does. He recommended $150 million. This would be new funding for public schools, including $50 million for rural schools, their facilities, mental health, and school safety. On top of that, I think he recommended $50 million to support public money going to private school choice. And this is a big deal because that was sort of the topic last session, and I think it will continue to be the topic this session, how we approach education and whether or not the state will offer public money for private schools or homeschools. We can get into that a little bit more, but some of the other key takeaways from Governor Little's State of the State, he proposed $100 million in tax relief going back to Idahoans. I think some of the House Republicans would like it to be more, but he proposed $100 million. There were some focus on natural resources, things like $100 million for fire management. That includes both money for the fire season, but also raises and retention for wildland firefighters, $30 million for critical water infrastructure, as well as other infrastructure projects. He also expressed support for health and welfare's plans to I guess, improve the foster care system, which has been in crisis for a couple of years. He proposed as much as $9.6 million for the foster care system. That's not quite as much as what health and welfare is asking for, but he is supportive of the process. So I think he went through quite the list, but those were the key takeaways. I think the biggest headline, without question, is his support for education freedom, but he did make it clear that he has caveats. He used the term fair, responsible, transparent, and accountable is what he wants to see in a bill regarding school choice, because that was the biggest topic of discussion in the last legislative session. Before the State of the State started, Representative Wendy Horman unveiled her bill, which would be a tax credit for private school expenses or other things like micro schools, learning pods, homeschools. And she, the bill that she proposed, which has not been introduced yet, also had a $50 million cap. So it would coincide with what Governor Little, with what his, I guess, proposal was. Again, this hasn't been proposed yet. And we can get into the weeds on what that bill was if you like, but that's my rundown of a 24-minute speech in just a couple of minutes.
So I do want to go a little bit more into what the governor had to say about private school choice. So Kevin, let me bring you into the conversation because you did watch this speech. And in fact, You wrote about this after, saying that the governor did a big about face on private school choice.
It's a major departure, Gemma. I mean, for the first 6 years in office, Governor Little has proposed putting no money into private school choice and has been very skeptical about the whole idea. Whenever he's been asked about private school choice, he said, well, hold on. We have a lot of school choice in Idaho. You have homeschooling, you have charter schools, you have magnet schools, you have all of these other options available to parents already. So he's been openly skeptical about private school choice. So this $50 million line item that he placed in the budget to cover some kind of a private school choice bill is a major departure for him.
And Kevin, from all the years covering this debate around school choice and the governor's hesitancy, how surprised were you, though, that he did incorporate this into his State of the State, making it a priority this year?
Well, I think it is a surprise. I think it is also a reaction, I suppose, to some of the sentiment that has been growing behind private school choice for the past several years. Representative Wendy Horman, who has been one of the proponents of private school choice, who has, by the way, proposed a $50 million tax credit that would support private schools. When she was asked about it the first day of the session, a couple hours before the governor announced his proposal, Representative Horman said, that she feels like the time may have arrived now for a private school choice bill to become law. This has been an issue, as Ruth indicated, it was a big issue last legislative session. It was a big election issue too. So I think that this departure may be a reaction to what we've seen in terms of kind of the political momentum on the private school choice issue.
I mean, this is just the beginning of these conversations, definitely.
It's definitely
Kyle,
the beginning.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
At the beginning, you're already seeing. There was also a proposal that was made, and this bill is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to get a hearing, proposing a $250 million private school choice. So there's division even within the Republican Party about how big to go on a private school choice proposal. So there's, I think we'll see multiple proposals before this session is over. The big question is, will any of them reach the governor's desk, and will any of them, honor kind of the caveats that he laid out about private school choice, as Ruth talked about already?
Well, and Kevin, getting back to what you said about someone proposing this $250 million tax credit, we know when we've seen states who have implemented this, even when they've said, all right, we're going to do X amount, every single year that amount has gone up. So unless it's capped truly at $50 million, for time and in memoriam, if something passes, I mean, there is a possibility that every year this could be added to.
And that's always going to be the debate. And I think it's going to be the debate about this $50 million tax credit bill that we expect to see in the fairly near future. Representative Horman and Senator Lori Denton Hartog of Meridian, they're the key sponsors of this. And they have said this would not increase beyond that $50 million unless the legislature came in and made a conscious decision and actually voted to increase that cap. But political reality being what it is, if a $50 million program gets on the books and there is demand for it beyond the $50 million, there's going to be a lot of political pressure on legislators to increase that cap. That's just political reality. So that's why I think you're going to see opponents of this saying $50 million is too big, because we've seen what's happened in other states and we're fearful that the same thing could happen in Idaho. If you're an opponent, you don't want to open that door at all, even if it's a relatively limited program, limited to $50 million, which is still a lot of money, but it would, I think the opponents are going to draw a line in the sand here.
Well, and Kevin, the thing that stood out to me in the governor's speech in regards to this was it wasn't that he proposed $50 million. He did make it very clear that this money could not be taken away from public schools. So that had me wondering, well, okay, so when these legislators set the budget, if there is a bill that goes through, where are they going to find this $50 million? Because they can take it from public school, but the governor is saying don't do that.
I think what the governor is saying in his budget is he has earmarked $50 million separate from the public school budget that would go into private school choice. So that's how he would frame the argument that this is not taking money away from public schools because it's a line item in the budget for private school choice. So that's where he will come down. Opponents are going to say, well, yeah, but it's $50 million that you're taking out of the budget. It's $50 million that theoretically you could put into anything else, including public education. So, that's where the debate is going to start is, does this hurt public education or not? You're going to hear sharp divisions on that question.
So, Kyle, you actually took some time to track down House GOP leaders for their response to the governor's budget proposal. Yes, we've been talking about school choice, but Ruth laid out at the beginning of our conversation a lot of his priorities around the budget. So what did the GOP leaders have to say about what the governor is proposing in terms of the budget?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gemma. I guess first on school choice, House Republican leaders in a press conference, reporters asked them, the governor said that any school choice proposal needs accountability. We asked them, what does that look like to you? And House Assistant Majority Leader Jason Monk said he was hopeful that lawmakers can find solutions that both the governor and lawmakers can get behind, but he did say that parents are the ones most accountable for their kids' education. They also talked House Republicans also talked a lot about their other priorities for the session. I guess first the governor said he wants $100 million in tax cuts this year. House Speaker Mike Moyle said he wants to triple that. And Moyle also said he wants to do something similar to the governor's zero-based rulemaking initiative from a couple years ago. That's where state agencies trimmed down on administrative rules. That effort did catch some national attention, including by billionaire Elon Musk, who the governor referenced in the speech. Moyle says he wants to do something similar to that with Idaho's laws by asking state agencies to review statutes for a cleanup. And House Republicans also talked about other initiatives. They say a bill from last year that would have created a state crime for illegal immigration will make a comeback this year. That bill would have let local police arrest migrants who enter the U.S. illegally. Speaker Moyle also said there will be election security bills on a range of issues. And he specifically said he's pursuing a bill to establish criminal liability for malicious lies in elections. So there's a lot in store this session.
So, Kevin, let's turn to volleyball now. Governor Little actually got a standing ovation this week during his State of the State speech when he congratulated the Boise State University volleyball team for not playing against San Jose State. So first, Kevin, for folks who need a quick refresher, tell us about this issue and why Boise State forfeited, I believe, 2 games during their season. And frankly, it impacted their standing in the Mountain West. 3.
Yeah,
okay.
3. They forfeited 3 matches, including one in the Mountain West Conference's postseason tournament. And the reason Boise State forfeited these matches is because San Jose State reportedly, this has never been publicly confirmed, reportedly has a transgender athlete on its roster. So that takes us to this week, and that takes us to the legislature. As you mentioned, Governor Little praised the Boise State volleyball team for the position that they took, got a standing ovation for that. The first bill, really, that's come through the legislature, the first piece of legislation that has gotten out of a committee is a resolution that also praises the Boise State volleyball team and goes a little bit further than that. Even though this is a resolution, it's not a law if it passes, it doesn't have any force of law. The resolution also urges the NCAA and the Mountain West to rescind their policies on transgender athletics. This non-binding resolution passed a House committee this week. It heads to the House floor. It'll probably get a vote here in the next few days. Pass that committee on a party line vote, which might foreshadow what happens to this resolution when it hits the House floor. Legislature moving pretty quickly on social issues, even just in this first week of the session.
Okay, so Kevin, with that said, with this resolution, this in a way kind of ties into a DEI bill that lawmakers are looking at that could allow students and staff to actually seek damages from colleges. So tell us about this in particular, because haven't most of the public universities in Idaho already shuttered all of their DEI, organizations?
Yeah, a lot has happened on DEI just in the past few weeks. The State Board of Education passed a policy that basically is going to require the colleges and universities to close their DEI linked any kind of student center that might advance a DEI ideology. So Boise State has closed its campus centers. Idaho State has done likewise. The University of Idaho plans to follow suit. On top of that, though, you do have this bill, and it's not been introduced in a committee yet, but it was discussed by a DEI task force on Thursday afternoon. And yeah, this bill would allow students, alums, and staffers to seek financial damages if a university advances a DEI policy. It's kind of it's called a private cause of action. We've seen this in other legislation in the past few years, including the library law that passed a year ago. And it goes even further than that, this bill, or at least this draft of this bill. It would allow the Attorney General's office to pursue any complaints about DEI on college and university campuses and pursue cuts in the university budgets if the Attorney General finds violations, and cuts of up to 2% of a university's budget. So this is kind of a big deal. It's very early in the process. This bill has not been introduced yet. It hasn't been voted on in any committee, but a pretty far-reaching bill that we'll obviously watch to see where it goes.
So, Kevin, with that said, in this bill, I mean, how do they then, is there any definition on what DEI would be? Because, and I ask that question because I'm sitting here thinking, all right, so if you're anything other than white and male, does that mean you could sit here and say, well, that's DEI. Someone, got a better grade than me because, I'm a man, she's a girl. I mean, I'm thinking, and maybe I'm thinking about this too much, but I'm sitting here wondering, how do we define then what diversity, equity, and inclusion is?
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the central debates about DEI in Idaho and nationally. How do you define it? This bill, it seems to go out of its way to define or to prohibit DEI offices, DEI centers, DEI officers, diversity training. Sponsors will say, well, it also says what is still going to be allowed, that this bill would have nothing to do with university research, have nothing to do with speakers that come on campus, creative expression by students or university employees. But yes, the debate is really largely about what is and what is not DEI.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, I'm reading your article, and it says too that the bill would not restrict student groups. So does that mean they could have a DEI student group on campus?
I mean, yeah, I think that would basically mean that if students decided to put together a student group, an LGBTQ group, or a Latino group, or a Black student group, that would be allowed and that wouldn't be restricted. What this tries to do is prohibit any kind of institutional groups, which the legislature has already restricted in past years. They basically have said universities cannot use taxpayer money to support any of these kind of programs. So the colleges and universities have had to use student fees, or they've had to use private donations. So there have already been restrictions in place. The state board policy and now this proposed bill would really go a step further to say these programs are forbidden, no matter who would wind up paying for them.
Okay, so right now, though, Kevin, just to be clear, this is just a draft of a bill, and folks got a first look at it yesterday.
Right, it's a draft. It's been discussed by a task force, legislative task force looking at DEI. So it's not even really a committee per se. this task force cannot introduce legislation. They can't vote on legislation. They can only work on legislation. So if this bill goes anywhere, it'll go through a more traditional standing legislative committee. That has not even started at this point.
Mm-hmm. Kyle, you wrote a story about how changes to Idaho's abortion bans might not happen while lawmakers wait out some court lawsuits. Can you talk to us about this? Because I did notice that in the governor's State of the State address, there was nothing in regards to abortion or abortion bans or making these bans more clear. So talk to us about where we are with this and why legislators are basically waiting court rulings before they do anything.
Yeah. So while the governor didn't mention abortion laws in his State of the State address, he did talk to reporters about that the week before his State of the State. He said that lawmakers are probably going to do what they did last year and wait for the results of lawsuits challenging the bans. He says that's because they need additional clarity on all the different interpretations before they might pursue changes. So last year, lawmakers held off on amending Idaho's abortion ban while the U.S. Supreme Court considered a challenge by the Biden administration. That lawsuit's still ongoing, but it's not clear what'll happen with it since the Trump administration is soon taking office. So in the background, many Idaho doctors say that they struggle to provide medical care under Idaho's abortion bans. They say that the lack of clarity under the laws has led to more patients being emergency airlifted to other states, and doctors have asked lawmakers to make an exception in the law for maternal health, not just for mothers' lives as the law specifies.
So with that said, Kyle, again, though, they will wait until there's any type of decision on this from a court standpoint, correct?
Yeah. So the governor said that the Biden administration litigation is likely to survive in some form, even with the administration change. It's still active right now. In June, the Supreme Court ruled to let emergency Idaho physicians provide abortion care without fear of persecution. But the court handed the case down to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. They just heard oral arguments on the case last month.
So, Kyle, in the article you wrote, though, Idaho's House Speaker Mike Moyle said that the Idaho's abortion law is clear, correct?
Yeah, he said that, quote, if it's a life-saving procedure, you proceed with the procedure. He said right now the debate is figuring out the difference between the life of the mother and the emergency. And he says until we know where the courts are going to lie on that, it's hard to go forward with a bill that could maybe make things worse.
On the flip side of that, though, Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow, what did she have to say about this, Kyle?
Well, she said she didn't understand why lawmakers need the court to tell them anything. She said that the state's efforts over the past couple of years have kind of cremated our work to recruit doctors and medical residents and OBGYNs. And she said we need to be making sure that we're taking care of pregnant moms and not splitting hairs in a legislative room when an emergency is going on in a doctor's office.
Appreciate that update, Kyle. So, Ruth, let's talk about another issue on the table at the State House. And you learned this week about a bill that would have a mandatory fine for misdemeanor marijuana charges here in Idaho. So tell us about this.
Sure. This was a bill introduced by Representative Bruce Skog of Nampa. The bill, should it pass, and this was just an introductory hearing, would implement a $300 mandatory minimum fine for adults possessing less than 3 ounces of marijuana. So that's a misdemeanor charge. And currently there is no instruction to a judge on how much they should or should not fine an individual. Representative Skog introduced the same bill last year, except the fine he proposed was $420, which legislators thought was, number one, too high of a charge for individuals who are committing a nonviolent crime. But also, some legislators had concerns about taking away judicial discretion I think right now, I covered the courts for 10 years. Right now, I think judges will often tailor how much they fine a person based on how much how much income that individual has. I mean, $420 to a person who's a millionaire is nothing, but $420 to a person who's truly indigent and maybe has $2 to their name is a big deal. And so there were a lot of disputes about that last year in committee, and ultimately didn't go through. But this has been reduced to $300 for the misdemeanor crime.
So it's a bill right now, Ruth, correct? So what happens next in this?
Sure, it'll get a public hearing before the House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee, and people can go and testify on it at that point. I have not seen a date set, but it's something I'll definitely keep an eye on for agendas.
So, Kevin, the big city coffee story at Boise State will not go away. And there was an update this week along with a really big bill. Before you get to all of that, though, can you just give us a quick refresher on what this big city coffee case is?
Oh, come on, Gemma. The lawsuit has only been in 39
I
months
know.
old. I mean, let's what's the
Everybody
rush here?
knows.
Oh, this
Yeah,
all goes
right.
back to 2020. So Big City Coffee opened a campus location at Boise State at the university library. They closed 42 days later. And the crux of this whole lawsuit is, why did they close? Big City has always contended that they were pushed off a campus because the owner, Sarah Jo Fendley, is a vocal supporter of law enforcement. She has said that student activists didn't like that and pushed the university to push her off of campus. University has denied that. In September, a jury sided with Fendley and sided with Big City and said that she was entitled to basically $4 million in damages from the university. That is still in court. That is still being adjudicated at the district court level. And this whole case is likely to go to the Idaho Supreme Court once the district court is done with it. It's a long, protracted lawsuit, and there are millions of dollars on the line, millions of public dollars on the line here.
Okay, so with that said, Kevin, give us the update from this week, along with a really large bill that was introduced.
Right. So where things stand right now, the university made a bid to try to get the district judge, to throw out the jury's verdict or to give Boise State a new trial. Both of those motions were denied on Christmas Eve. Those rulings came down. So no new trial, no basically rejection of the $4 million jury verdict. The only thing the district judge did was she lowered that amount to about $3.7 million. So if that verdict remains intact, and if the university has to pay that out, that's $3.7 million of public money that'll have to be paid out. On top of that, we learned this week that Boise State has spent more than $1.5 million on its own legal team in this case. They've outsourced this case to private attorneys, $1.5 million and counting, because obviously if this case goes to Supreme Court, you go through an appeal process, the bills will only increase. On top of all of that, the Big City legal team has said that they are owed $1.7 million for their legal fees. That has not been awarded yet, and that's one of the issues that's being argued in district court. But the Big City legal team is saying, look, we won. We're the prevailing party. We're entitled to legal fees. So if that is paid out, that's taxpayer money that would go to that legal team. So yeah, add it up. We're into several millions of dollars of public money that is at stake here as this case continues to drag out.
So Kevin, talk to us about this other point, which is who's been bankrolling a big chunk of Big City's case, and the fact that this individual could get reimbursed for having bankrolled a lot of this.
Right. So Larry Williams is a very prominent conservative donor, lives in Boise, has given tens of thousands of dollars to legislative candidates, to state candidates. He bankrolled this case to at least the tune of about $475,000. That's how much he paid Big City's legal team, according to court documents. And Big City is saying we plan to reimburse Williams for the money that he fronted in this case if we get an award of attorney fees. So just another element of this story, and just another element of this lawsuit, and it kind of underscores the political implications of this entire case.
Oh, what about the fact that this is actually also being debated? Is Boise State, I guess, or the state, good for the $7.7 million? I mean, I'm thinking to myself, well, we've got a significant rainy day fund, so potentially, but this is actually a point of contention.
Yeah, this is another dispute that's going on in district court. So where it stands right now is the Boise State or the state of Idaho is being expected to kind of put up a bond, put up the amount of the money that they would have to pay in damages and attorney fees and set it aside in case they ultimately do have to pay that money out. Boise State and the state are saying, look, the state is solvent. If it comes to that point and we have to pay, we're good for the money, in effect, is what they're saying. That is still an issue that is before the district court. So it's one of the two big remaining issues that district court has to resolve before this case is exhausted in district court and ultimately winds up going to Supreme Court. But yeah, it's an interesting side angle. And, this is money that Boise State essentially can't use if they have to set it aside. It's money that just sort of is parked away and they can't spend it on anything else. It just sort of sits there while this case continues to drag out if they are forced to bond.
So at this point, Kevin, I mean, we're waiting for briefings and replies, and that is not even until the end of February. So we're nowhere near this wrapping up in district court, let alone, as you said, Boise State will likely take this to the Idaho Supreme Court.
It's at least a couple of months before the district court would have any kind of closure in this case. And that's at the bare minimum. I mean, the judge is going to take her time, I'm sure, looking at the filings and the briefings. And then, the Supreme Court, who knows how long it will take them to move on a case. This is not going away anytime soon. So we're 39 months after the initial lawsuit was filed, and we're going to be here a while.
Definitely. All right. Thanks for all of that update. So, Kyle, interesting story that you wrote this week. This is about how Idahoans can now get 6 months of birth control. This is all because of a new law. So can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so the legislature nearly passed the new law last year. It requires insurance companies to cover 6 months of prescription birth control starting this year. Idaho Senate Minority Leader Melissa Lindrow, a voice who sponsors the bill, said the law should make it easier and who only access 1 or 3 month birth control supplies beforehand. She says that supports the deal now given those abortion bans. She says she's tried to pass similar laws 3 times, and this is the 5th time the legislature has considered such a bill. Last year, the bill barely passed. It passed the House by 1 vote and the Senate by 3 votes.
But at this point, Kyle, this is law, though, right? So, I mean, it's 6 months of birth control you can now get as long as it's a prescription here in Idaho.
Yeah, as long as your insurance plan covers prescription contraception, this law requires insurance companies to cover up to 6 months of supply at one time.
All right. Ruth, before we wrap up, it looks like lawmakers are taking aim once again at how citizen initiatives get on the ballot here in Idaho, and once again wanting to make this even more difficult. So explain to us what this new proposal, this new bill would do if passed.
Sure. This is a bill from Representative Bruce Skog out of Nampa, and State Affairs introduced it. It would raise the passage threshold of a citizens initiative to 60% rather than the current passage rate of 50% plus 1. Representative Bruce Skog says he believed the initiative process is broken, and that there's too much out-of-state money coming in to these political action groups that fund the process. I think it comes after, of course, we had Proposition 1 on the ballot in November. It's worth noting that proposition failed overwhelmingly. 69% of voters voted against it. But it's not the first time there have been bills to make it more challenging for a citizens initiative bill to pass. This bill is very similar to what Florida does. Florida has a 60% threshold, and it made the news a lot in November because in November, Florida had two initiatives on the ballot, one regarding cannabis and one regarding abortion. And they surpassed 50%, but they did not make the 60% threshold. It's also worth noting that there's currently a group that has filed petitions with the Secretary of State for a Reproductive Freedom and Privacy Act that would be in the 2026 election. They have not collected all the signatures needed yet, but from everything they've said, they're attempting to get it on the 2026 ballot. And should this bill pass, it would make it harder for that initiative to pass. But it's very early. We haven't had a public hearing yet. I assume when there is a public hearing, many people will testify.
And Ruth, with that said, Representative Todd Kelly of Boise had some interesting comments about this in regards to. So tell us what he said. Basically, looking at what it takes to get someone elected versus a citizens initiative.
Sure. So he made several points. First, there was an Idaho Supreme Court case that made it clear that the initiative process is a fundamental right of voters, as well as when they vote, the House of Representatives, they only have to surpass a 50% plus one. And we are asking we would be asking citizens to surpass a 60% threshold. And so I think he took issue with that. And I suspect when this goes to committee, that'll be something that comes up regularly.
Mm-hmm. And you point out too in your article, real quick, Melissa, Ruth, before we wrap up. I mean, of course, that citizens initiative, as you mentioned in November, overwhelmingly did not pass, 69% of Idahoans. But if we go back to Medicaid expansion, which is really when we started really discussing once again initiatives and all of that, voter initiatives in Idaho once again, it passed. And it would have passed even with this bill in place.
Correct. In 2018, Medicaid expansions passed with 61% of people voting in favor. Medicaid expansion was a subject, though, that I think there was a lot more people on both sides of the aisle that could get behind Medicaid expansion. I think Proposition 1 had a different kind of pushback. There was both in-state and out-of-state money coming into it, and that led to its failure. But you're right, Medicaid expansion would have passed even with this threshold.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, appreciate the update on that, Ruth. And as you said, it's at its beginning phases, but I'm sure we'll hear more about it. I want to thank our Reporter Roundtable today and all of the great work that all of you do. Folks, please make sure that you go to all of their websites, you check out all of the work that our journalists here in Idaho do. So thank you to Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Kyle Fonenstill with the Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Richards, senior reporter and blogger with Idaho Education News. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.